My son raised his hand, slapped me, and laughed, saying I should know my place. It was in the $520,000 home I built for him, with every dollar I ever earned. That night, betrayal burned inside me. But he never saw the papers locked away, proof that this house was still mine. You won't believe what I did next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat alone in the living room of my house, a house worth $520,000, the house I had built with my bare hands and my broken back over the course of a lifetime. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting long streaks of gold across the hardwood floor. I stared at the wedding picture of my wife, Mary, resting on the mantel, her smile frozen in time, warm and alive, while mine had turned hollow. The walls seemed to echo with memories, laughter that once filled this room, but now only silence remained. And in that silence I could hear the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock, each tick pulling me deeper into memories I both cherished and regretted. I thought back to every dollar I had spent on David, my only son, the boy I believed would one day stand beside me, not against me. I remembered signing the checks for his college tuition, totaling $60,000. I worked double shifts at the factory, ate sandwiches for dinner, and skipped buying new clothes, just to ensure that tuition was paid on time. I recalled the day I handed him the keys to a $25,000 car, the first real car I ever bought for anyone. His smile was wide that day. He hugged me and said he'd never forget what I had done. But he did forget. The same son who once relied on me for every step of his future was now the one plotting to take my house, to push me aside as if I had never mattered. I could still see the stacks of bills I paid for him, times I covered his debts when his credit cards ran too high. Thousands upon thousands of dollars poured into his life while I convinced myself it was all worth it, because he was my blood, because he was my son. But money wasn't the only thing I gave up. I gave up pieces of myself. I remembered the nights I had to cancel dinners with friends because David needed help with a project or a late-night ride. I remembered the vacations Mary and I never took, the trip to the Grand Canyon we dreamed of, the cruise she always mentioned, both sacrificed because there was always another bill for David. I remembered evenings when I sat alone at the table with just beans and rice, saving the better food for him, telling myself that fathers are supposed to sacrifice. I remembered the rainy night when David was 12, his fever burning hot, and I carried him on my back through streets flooded with water, 3 miles to the hospital, soaking wet but desperate to save him. He doesn't remember that, or maybe he chooses not to, because today he looks at me like I'm just an old man standing in the way of his comfort. I looked around the living room again at the framed photographs on the wall. David's graduation picture, me standing beside him with pride, my arm around him, his diploma in hand. That diploma cost me $60,000, but the moment was priceless, or so I thought then. Now, when I see that picture, it stings like salt on an open wound. It isn't pride anymore. It's a cruel reminder that I invested everything, and all I got in return was betrayal. I looked at the house itself, the polished oak table I had built with my own hands, the brick fireplace I laid stone by stone, even the chair I was sitting in, a chair Mary had chosen for me because she said it looked sturdy, reliable, just like me. Now it only felt heavy with loneliness. The very walls that once sheltered my family now felt like prison bars, and the air was thick with betrayal. What used to be my sanctuary had become a place where my son's laughter turned cruel, where my sacrifices turned into weapons used against me. The contrast between then and now cut deep. Once this house was filled with the scent of Mary's cooking, the sound of David's laughter as a boy running down the hallway, his shoes squeaking against the floor. Now the silence was heavy, broken only by the echo of his grown-up voice mocking me, telling me I was nothing, that I was in the way. The wedding picture of Mary wasn't just a memory anymore. It had become a mirror of what I lost. Love, respect, loyalty, all corroded by greed. My heart ached, not just for what David had done, but for the way money twisted the very meaning of family. For a long time, I sat there, drowning in anger and sorrow. I felt foolish for believing David would care for me the way I had cared for him. Foolish for thinking money could buy love, or at least loyalty. Maybe I had been blind, too blind with hope, too blind with pride in my only son. Maybe it's my fault, I whispered to the empty room. Maybe I gave too much, trusted too much. The words hung in the air, heavy as the ticking clock. For the first time in my life, I admitted to myself that love without boundaries is dangerous. I thought I was building a future for both of us, but maybe I was only building a cage for myself. And yet, in that same moment of despair, a spark of clarity began to flicker. I realized something David had overlooked, something he thought didn't matter. The deed? The house was still mine. My name was still printed clearly on the papers tucked away in my desk drawer. For all his arrogance, for all his words and his slap across my face, he forgot that I still held the power. That realization was like a sudden breath of air after drowning. I wasn't as powerless as I had felt. I had something solid, something legal, something undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt a shift inside me, from helplessness to strength, from despair to determination. I leaned forward in the chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and let my eyes wander toward the cabinet across the room. Inside that cabinet were files, old insurance papers, and most importantly, the deed to this house. My house. I stood up slowly, my knees aching but steady, and crossed the room. My hand trembled as I opened the drawer, and there it was, the stack of documents that carried my name. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal. The ink faded, but still firm, and I felt Mary's presence beside me. I lifted my head and looked at her photograph on the mantel. "Mary," I whispered, "maybe it's finally time I protect what we built. Maybe it's time I protect myself." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. It felt like I was speaking to her across the years, and I could almost see her nodding back, urging me forward. Before I closed the drawer, I made one small but symbolic decision. My phone buzzed on the table, another message from David, no doubt filled with commands or complaints. For years, I answered every message, every call, trying to keep the peace. This time, I let it buzz until it stopped. Then I erased the message without reading it. That simple act felt like a chain snapping loose around my chest. For the first time, I chose my peace over his demands. For the first time, I felt in control. It was small, but it was powerful. It was the beginning of something new. As I held the deed in my hand, the ticking clock sounded different. It no longer felt like a countdown to my downfall. It felt like a drumbeat, steady and strong, leading me toward a fight I had to face. The room around me hadn't changed, but my perception had. The old chair wasn't just a seat of loneliness anymore, it became a throne of decision. The walls weren't prison bars, they were shields I still owned. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation. Every detail in that room reminded me that I had built this life, and I still had the power to defend it. That evening, as the light faded and the house grew quiet, I sat with the deed in my lap, my heart calmer but sharper than ever. The betrayal still burned, the pain still lingered, but now there was something else: determination. I wasn't going to let David push me into a corner. I wasn't going to let greed erase decades of sacrifice. I wasn't going to surrender the only thing Mary and I had built together, not without a fight. As the clock struck 7, I made a silent vow to myself. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. I woke before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold before I remembered to drink it. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breath. I laid the folder in front of me, the same brown folder I had pulled from the cabinet the night before. Inside were the papers that mattered. The deed with my name on it, insurance records, tax receipts, letters from the county recorder. My hands had shaken when I first opened it, but now they were steady. It felt like the difference between standing in a storm and finally stepping under a roof. I took a long breath, reached for the phone, and called my lawyer. "Mr. Hayes," I said, my voice clear, not a tremor in it. "I need to see you this morning." The drive to Robert Hayes's office took 15 minutes. I took the old truck, the one with the bench seat and the rattle in the door that Mary used to tease me about. The sun was just high enough to light the edges of the trees, and the road shimmered with a thin layer of heat already rising. I pulled into the small lot behind the brick building and sat for a second, palms pressed to the steering wheel. My heart was slow, not heavy, not racing, slow and steady, like a drum that knew its job. Robert came to the lobby himself. He had gray at his temples, a tie I'd seen a dozen times, and the kind of eyes that study a man without making him feel inspected. "Tom," he said, "you okay?" I nodded. "I'm better than yesterday," I answered. "Today I'm ready." We went into his office, and when I laid the deed on his desk, I did it with both hands. No shaking. He read in silence for a minute, then looked up. "It's still yours," he said. "We'll make sure it stays yours. Tell me everything." I told him the truth. Not every insult, not every sigh from David or smirk from Jessica, but the facts that matter in a room like that. The slap, the words, the claim that this was his house now, the way he laughed, the way she laughed. Robert didn't interrupt. He wrote a few notes. When I finished, he leaned back and steepled his fingers. "Here's what we do," he said. "We tighten everything. We put the property into a revocable living trust in your name. You remain trustee. You control every lock. You sign every check. We revoke any informal promises. We update your will. We record a notice to prevent any funny business at the recorder's office. And we get a locksmith lined up, but not yet. Not until you say so." Hearing those words, I felt something move inside my chest, like a knot loosening. Robert slid a pen across the desk. I picked it up. Funny thing about a pen. Yesterday I couldn't hold a fork without my hand trembling at dinner. Today the pen felt like an anchor. I signed my name on form after form. My signature looked the same as it had 20 years ago. Strong, clean. I initialed paragraphs. I reviewed clauses. I asked questions, short and plain. Robert answered in the same way. No rush, no pressure, just clarity. When we were done, his assistant, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes, brought in a stack of copies and a little bottle of water. She glanced at me the way a daughter might. "Sir, are you all right?" she said, soft but steady. I swallowed and nodded. "I am now," I told her. That small concern from a stranger went straight through me. It stung in a good way and a bad way at the same time. Good because kindness still exists in this world. Bad because the son I raised could not offer even that. I left with the folder heavier than when I came in, but it wasn't paperweight. It was a new kind of weight. Authority. On the way home, I stopped at the bank. The lobby smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. A television near the ceiling ran the news on mute. I met with a manager at a small glass desk. I set down my wallet, my driver's license, and the letter Robert had printed for me. "I want alerts on any attempt to open a line of credit with this property as collateral," I said. "I want to freeze the home equity line that was pre-approved but never activated. I want fraud alerts on my profile, and I want a note on the account that no transactions occur without my in-person approval." The manager, a man with a tie too tight for his neck, stopped typing to look me in the eye. "We can do that," he said. "Are you sure you don't want to add an authorized user?" I smiled without any warmth. "No," I said. "Just me." He nodded, then asked that same human question I had heard in Robert's office. "Are you okay, sir?" I breathed in, breathed out. "I will be," I answered. "Thank you for asking." My voice sounded different to my own ears. Not hoarse, not small. Even the way I pushed the chair back from the desk felt different. I wasn't floating through my day anymore. My feet were on the ground. I drove home and put the new documents in the folder. I slid the folder into the inside pocket of my old Navy jacket, the one Mary used to say made me look like a Sunday gentleman. I left the jacket on a chair near the door. I knew where it was. I knew that at any moment, with one motion, I could have my hands on everything that mattered. That evening, as the sky turned the color of peach flesh and the street lamps blinked awake, I cooked dinner. Not much. A pot of beef stew, onions, carrots, potatoes, the way David liked it when he was 10. I took my time with it, stirred slowly, let the steam rise and fog the window over the sink. I set the table the way Mary did. Napkin folded, spoon to the right, bread in a small basket. When David and Jessica came in, the air changed. Jessica's perfume arrived first, then the clatter of her heels. David walked like he owned the place. He didn't look at the table. He looked at me. "What's this?" he said. I told him it was dinner. He made a face, an exaggerated thing, eyes rolling, mouth twisted. "We don't eat this stuff," he said to his wife, loud like a boy performing for the crowd. "This is poor food?" Jessica laughed behind her hand. I felt the heat rise in my neck. My hands were steady on the back of the chair. "It's what we had," I said. "When you were little, you used to ask for seconds." He snorted. "Yeah, well, we're not little anymore. We order out. You should keep up." I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't invite them to sit. I pulled my chair out and sat down alone. I lifted the spoon. The stew was simple, warm, the kind of food that fills a man in a way salt and fat and flash never do. I ate slowly. They stood there, waiting for me to react, and when I didn't, they drifted to the living room, voices low, laughter thin and sharp. I finished my bowl, rinsed the spoon, and set it in the rack. A man can feel 1,000 things at once: shame, hurt, memory. But that night, all those feelings settled into one word in my chest: enough. After dinner, I hung the jacket over my arm and stepped outside. I walked the block once, the way men do when they need the night air to clear their heads. Neighbors waved. I waved back. When I got to the corner, I stopped under the streetlight and called Robert from there. "Make the locksmith plan," I said. "Not yet, but be ready." He said he would. Then he paused. "Tom," he said, "tonight you rest. Tomorrow we meet again. I want to show you something." The next morning, his office felt brighter. Maybe it was the sun. Maybe it was me. He had a laptop open, a browser window pulled up to the county court site. "Public records," he said. "Sometimes they tell stories people don't want told." He typed David's name. A list appeared. "My son's name is on traffic tickets. A late credit card judgment from 2 years back, a small claims case he lost for $4,000 to a contractor." Then he typed Jessica's maiden name. The results were colder. A civil judgment for $12,000 on a failed boutique. A lien that had been satisfied, but the paper was there. A landlord-tenant case, dismissed, but ugly to read. He didn't push them toward me, he just let them sit on the screen. "I'm not saying we use this," he said softly. "I'm saying now, you know. If they try to spin the story, you have facts. If we need leverage at settlement, you have it." Leverage. It's a hard word for a father to hold when the person on the other end is his son. But I understood. In a fight where a man is outnumbered, facts are weight. Facts are the difference between begging and deciding. I nodded. "Print them," I said. "File them. We'll keep them quiet. For now." We spent the next hour tightening the plan. Robert explained the trust papers again, the way the property would be titled, and how notices would be filed at the recorder's office to block any attempt to slip in a lien or a quitclaim. We drafted a simple letter to the utility companies, placing everything back in my sole name: gas, electric, water, and the internet, which David said he paid for and never did. We arranged a post office box so any mail that mattered wouldn't pass through hands that mocked me. When he slid another pen across the desk, I took it and signed. My hand moved in a straight line, like a carpenter cutting wood he knows by heart. Each signature made a sound on the paper, a small whisper that felt like victory. On my way out, Robert's assistant met me in the hall with a thin folder. "Copies for you," she said, "and, sir, please take care of yourself." I tucked the folder under my arm. "I will," I said, more than ever. Back at the house, the afternoon felt heavy, but not with dread, heavy with purpose. I laid the new documents on the dining table and checked each one against the originals. Trust agreement, certification of trust, directions to the locksmith, draft of the updated will, contact sheet for the bank manager. I slipped them into the inner pocket of my jacket. I walked to the mantel and looked at Mary again. "You always said I was slow to anger," I told her picture. "Turns out I'm slow to surrender, too." That evening, David came home early. Jessica was with him, carrying a tote bag, her laptop under her arm. They sat us down in the living room like we were in a meeting at some office I didn't know. David opened a spreadsheet on the screen. Colored cells, rows of numbers. He grinned like a coach about to explain a play. "We've been planning," he said. "Here's what makes sense. We list the house now, we'll get top dollar. 520, maybe more. We use the proceeds to cover assisted living for you. We'll handle the details. Less stress for you." He made it sound generous, professional, like they were doing me a favor. I watched. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Jessica chimed in. "We already toured a facility," she said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Nice place. They have a piano in the lobby and a garden out back." She tapped a line on the spreadsheet. "See? This is what it would cost monthly. Meals included, medical monitoring, safer for you." David nodded. "And then we can finally update the house for resale. The kitchen's dated. We'll get a contractor in. Flip it quick." I leaned back and let the weight of the jacket press into my shoulders. I could feel the edge of the folder against my ribs. It was like armor. David scrolled to another tab. "Also," he said, "remember that note you wrote me when I graduated? The one where you said the house was for the family? That you wanted it to be a place for us?" He reached into the tote and pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with time. "You wrote it," he said. "You said the house was ours." He thought that paper was a weapon. For a second, it did hit me like a stone. I remembered the day I wrote it. Pride, hope, a father's heart. But I looked at it the way a man looks at a photograph of a bridge that washed out long ago. A sweet thing, a past thing, not a legal thing, not binding. "That was a letter," I said quietly. "Not a deed." He blinked, the smallest crack. Jessica's voice sharpened. "We're trying to help," she said. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I let the quiet stretch. They shifted. Certain people don't fidget. People who are bluffing do. I saw the bluff. I saw the fear under the gloss. And I felt an odd kind of calm. They had brought their best argument. Spreadsheets, an old letter, a tour of a facility I had not asked to see. They thought they were winning. They thought the old man would fold. "I hear you," I said finally. "I hear everything you're saying." My voice was even. "I'll think about it." That line soothed David. He mistook my calm for consent. He smiled. "Good," he said. "We'll line up a couple of realtors." I nodded. "You do what you need to do," I said. "I'll do what I need to do." He missed the second half of that sentence, or he pretended to. When they went out later for dinner, I watched them through the window as they crossed the driveway. Jessica's hand was on David's arm. They looked like a couple walking into a party, not a war they were about to lose. I turned from the glass, took my jacket from the hook, and sat at the table with the folder in front of me. I ran my palm over the cover. I thought of the bank manager, the way he asked if I was okay. I thought of Robert, steady as a fence post, telling me the law was on my side. I thought of Mary, her picture on the mantel, her smile a light I could follow in the dark. I picked up the phone and called Robert again. "It's time," I said. "Schedule the locksmith for the day after tomorrow, first thing." He didn't ask if I was sure. He knew. Done, he said. Tom, there's one more thing. Papers rustled on his end. I filed the notice at the recorder today. It's indexed. Any title company that tries anything will trip over it. And I ran one more search. Public filings. Your son applied for a home equity line last month on his condo. He was denied. Too much revolving debt. That's why the push. They need your equity to bail them out. I closed my eyes. Not from pain, from recognition. I figured, I said. Print it. File it. We may need it later. When I hung up, the house sounded different again. Not empty, not loud, ready. The old clock ticked in the hall, not as a countdown to anything dreadful, but as a steady measure of my choices. I stood, walked to the sink, and poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. I could feel it move through me, cold and clean. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room. I touched the back of the chair where I had sat so many nights, and then I spoke into the quiet, as if Mary were sitting across from me with her hands folded. They think I've lost, I said. They think I'm a weak old man. But they don't know what I know. They don't know what I hold. I slid the folded deed from the folder and held it up, the paper catching a beam of lamplight. It looked small in my hand, and yet it was the heaviest thing in the room. Not heavy like a burden, heavy like a key. Outside, a car door slammed. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life kept moving in its usual way. But in my house, in the home I built stone by stone, the ground had shifted. I placed the deed back into the folder, buttoned the inner pocket, and put the jacket on the chair by the door. I went to bed earlier than usual. I slept without dreams. When I woke, I sat on the edge of the mattress and listened to the morning. Birds. A garbage truck on the street. The water heater is kicking on. Ordinary sounds. I smiled to myself. The ordinary felt good again. I dressed, jeans, a clean shirt, the navy jacket. I looked in the mirror and saw a man who had been knocked down, then stood up again. Not taller, not younger, just standing. Before I left the bedroom, my phone buzzed. A text from David. Short, bossy. Call the realtor at 9. We're moving forward. I let it buzz a second time. Then I pressed my thumb to the screen and deleted the message without replying. That small click of the button felt like a door closing softly on a room I no longer needed to enter. In the kitchen, I wrote a note, not to David, not to Jessica, to myself. 3 sentences. Today I protect what is mine. Today I finished what I started. Today I stop apologizing for surviving. I left the note under the magnet on the fridge where Mary used to stick recipes. I touched the edge of her photograph on the mantel on my way to the door. Stay with me, I whispered. Just a little longer. As I stepped onto the porch, the morning air was cool on my face. I pulled the door shut behind me and tested the deadbolt with one firm twist. Solid. I slid my keys into my pocket, felt the weight of them against the fabric, and smiled. They had no idea. Not yet. They thought the spreadsheets would save them. They thought an old letter would bind me. They thought I still lived in the version of myself that would trade dignity for peace. I walked to the truck, turned the key, and listened to the engine catch. Then I said the words out loud, to the windshield, to the sky, to the day that was waiting. They think I've lost, but the game has only begun. I drove toward Robert's office, toward the county recorder, toward the next step I had set in motion. In my mind, I could already see what would come. Locks turning, papers recorded, a truth printed too clearly to ignore, and something else, tucked quietly in a file, for the right moment. The denial letter for David's loan, or the judgments, the facts no laughter can erase. They didn't know I now held something that would change everything. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 2 below to let me know you're here with me. I woke to a sky the color of pewter and a house that felt like it was holding its breath. The folder lay where I had left it on the dining table, edges straight, the deed on top, the trust papers beneath it, the letters from the bank, and the recorder clipped in neat stacks. I touched each page with the flat of my hand, not to check if it was real, but to remind myself that I was. I had not imagined my new steadiness. It lived in my chest now, slow and calm. I put on my navy jacket, slid the folder into the inside pocket, and walked to the living room where the old clock ticked like a metronome for a song I finally knew how to play. By noon, their contempt had a schedule. Jessica's laughter echoed down the hall like silverware clinking in a dish. David's voice filled the doorway before he did. "We're late for a showing," he said, not to me, to the air, as if the house was already on the market. "Dad, make sure you don't touch the kitchen. It needs to stay clean for photos." It was my kitchen, my counters, my sink. My hand rubbed the oak table I built when his feet could not reach the floor. The wood felt warm. He didn't notice. He never did. "You're becoming a lot to manage," Jessica added, soft but sharp. "We're doing our best here." The words slid across the room like oil. They wanted me to slip. I didn't. That afternoon, I climbed the small stepladder and hung David's framed diploma where the light catches the glass. $60,000 in tuition, a father's pride pressed behind a clear pane. I wiped a thumbprint from the corner and stepped back. The house went very quiet. Even the clock seemed to wait. They noticed it when they came in from the garage. David blinked first, then frowned. "Why would you put that out?" he said. Not a question, a complaint. I kept my voice even. "It belongs here. It belongs to what we built." He barked a laugh and shook his head. "That's mine. I earned that degree. You didn't pass my exams. You didn't write my papers." Jessica leaned into him, smiling. "Exactly. He always makes everything about himself." The words hit like gravel in a shoe. Irritating, mean, and proof of where I stood now. I felt the anger rise, then settle, like a wave lifting a boat and setting it down without tipping it over. I looked at the frame again. Pride had become proof, not of his effort, of my investment, of my years, of the line he crossed. Evening fell, and with it the last scene I had allowed in my house. I set a kettle on the stove for tea. I moved slowly, not from age, but from care. David brushed past my shoulder hard enough to tilt me a step. He did not apologize. "We're talking to a realtor on Tuesday," he said, loud, so it would stick to the walls. I answered without looking at him. "You can talk to whoever you like." The kettle began to whisper. He stepped closer. I could smell his cologne and the tang of summary power he thought he owned. "This is my house now," he said, voice low, testing me, pushing. I turned to face him. I did not raise my hands. I did not raise my voice. "No," I said. "It is not." The slap came from nowhere and everywhere at once. His palm across my cheek, the crack of it, the way light flashed in my eyes for a second. Jessica laughed. David laughed louder, like a boy on a dare. "Know your place," he added, as if he had rehearsed it in a mirror. I stood there with the kettle singing in the background. I tasted metal. I swallowed hard and reached past him to turn off the stove. Then I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand. My breath stayed steady. My heartbeat did not run. I looked at them both as if I had just read their names on a piece of paper. "I know my place," I said, "and I know yours." I walked to my jacket, slid the folder deeper into the pocket, and left the room without another word. I drove to Robert Hayes's office, with the window cracked and the night air cooling the sting on my face. He was waiting with a light on. He did not waste time pretending he didn't notice the mark. "We're done asking," he said, after I told him what happened. "Tonight we move." He pulled out a small stack of papers and laid them down like cards. An elder abuse restraining order request. A notice revoking any permission to occupy. A letter from the trust to the locksmith authorizing immediate change of locks. Copies of the filings recorded that morning. The trust deed, the memorandum putting title companies on notice. He slid a pen to me. "Sign," he said. My hand did not tremble. The pen made a soft scratch on the paper, the sound of a line being drawn. By dawn, a locksmith van idled at the curb outside my house. The man wore a ball cap, and a polite expression. He worked quickly, efficiently, quietly, his tools clicking like insects. New deadbolts, fresh cylinders, new keys in a small envelope he handed to me with a nod. "If you need door closers adjusted, call me," he said. "No charge." I thanked him, and when he left, I stood on the porch and turned each lock twice. The sound was deep and certain, like a vault closing. I breathed in. The world smelled like cut grass and something clean. I put the keys in my pocket and did not think about the old ones. They came home at 6, voices high and easy, Jessica's heels tapping the concrete. The look on David's face when the key failed was a quiet masterpiece. Surprise, then confusion, then anger chasing both. He tried again, harder, like the door had offended him. "What did you do?" he shouted through the wood. "Open this." He pounded once, twice, 3 times, his fist flattening against the panel I sanded by hand years ago. "Dad," he said, the words stretched thin. "This is illegal." It was not. Robert had made sure of that. I did not answer. I stood at the far end of the hall, out of sight, listening to the frantic step change in his shoes. Jessica's voice went high. "Call someone," she said. "Call the police." The police came, 2 young officers who looked too fresh to shave. They were polite. They were firm. It was a civil matter. The property deed said what it said. The restraining order papers, stamped and temporary until the hearing, carried their own weight. One officer knocked and asked if I would like to speak. I opened the door a careful inch and handed him a copy through the gap. "Thank you," I said. "I'm fine." He nodded and walked back down the steps, his boots heavy on the concrete. Out by the curb, Mrs. Alvarez from next door stood with her small dog, arms folded tight, concern etching her brow. When David saw her, he turned the volume up and tried to make the street our stage. "He's losing it," he said. "He needs help." She shook her head slowly. "I've seen who needs help," she answered, loud enough to carry. "And it isn't him." The next day, we went to court. Not a grand jury trial. A compact courtroom with dark wood, an American flag on a pole, and a judge who wore weariness like a second robe. Robert sat to my left. To my right was Earl, an old friend from the plant, shoulders like an oak beam, eyes kind as a winter sky. Behind us, Mrs. Alvarez clasped her hands around her dog's leash and nodded when I looked back. It smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. The clerk called our case. We stood. Robert opened with the simple story, not the spectacle. "Your Honor," he said, "this is a petition for a restraining order and a request to affirm the lawful possession of a home at a specific address. My client is 70, competent, and the sole owner of the property. Last night, after months of escalating verbal abuse, his adult son struck him and threatened his occupancy, claiming ownership that does not exist. We have the deed. We have the trust. We have filed notice. We have a bank letter confirming a fraud alert placed on any attempt to leverage the property. We ask for protection and for clarity." The judge looked over his glasses at me. "Sir," he said, "do you understand what you're asking for today?" My voice carried in the small room. "Yes, Your Honor. I want to live in my house without being hit. I want to sleep without hearing that I'm a burden. I want to be left alone by people who think a family home is an ATM." The judge didn't smile, but something in his face softened for a second. "Understood," he said. Robert called our first witness. Not a parade, just a neighbor with a leash wrapped around her wrist. Mrs. Alvarez stepped to the stand and swore to tell the truth. Her testimony was short and clean. She had seen David yelling. She had heard his words through the thin evening air. She had watched my hands carry groceries while he used his mouth to throw stones. "He is clear," she said, pointing at me. "He is kind. He is not confused. He is tired of being pushed." The judge thanked her. Then Robert called Earl. Earl does not dress his sentences in fancy clothes. He looked at the judge and said, "Tom's worked 50 years with the same hands that built that house. You're looking at a man who knows right from wrong. He's not mean. He's not cruel. He's done being used." The testimony lasted 4 minutes. The truth landed with more weight than speeches ever could. Then it was David's turn. He approached the table with a folder he thought could save him. Spreadsheets again. Typed notes. That old letter I had written when he graduated, the one about the house being a home for our family. He tried to look confident. His voice started loud and slid toward pleading. "Your Honor," he said, "my father promised." The judge lifted a palm. "Promises are not deeds," he said. "Show me legal ownership." David faltered. Jessica leaned forward and whispered in his ear, her lips thin with urgency. He reached into the folder and produced the letter, holding it as if a memory could be a law. Robert stood. "Objection," he said, gentle as a teacher, irrelevant to the title. "It is sentiment, not conveyance." The judge glanced down, read 2 lines, and nodded. Sustained. Let's keep to the point. Robert did not smile. He waited. Then he placed our card on the table, not with flourish, but with care. "Your Honor, one more document for the record." He passed a small stack to the clerk, who handed it up. "Public filings," Robert explained. "A denial letter for a home equity line of credit on the son's condo last month due to high revolving debt. Civil judgments in the wife's name. We submit not to shame, but to context. The push to liquidate my client's home is not about his health or his safety. It is about their trouble and their need." The silence was the loudest sound in the room. David's jaw worked like a man chewing glass. Jessica went pale, then red, then pale again. She reached for his arm. He shook her off. The judge stacked the papers, squared them against his pad, and spoke in a voice that traveled to the back row and stayed there. "The house is owned by the petitioner's trust. The restraining order is granted temporarily, pending a further hearing. The respondents are ordered to stay away from the property, except to retrieve personal items with a police standby at a time arranged through counsel. No contact, no threats, no removal of fixtures. No claims of ownership are to be asserted to any third party under penalty of contempt." His gavel did not bang. He simply set his pen down. It was enough. David tried to speak, tried to shape the air into something that could hold him up. "This is ridiculous," he blurted. "He's confused. He doesn't know what he's doing." The judge turned his head slowly, the way a father looks at a boy who has pushed too far. "He knows exactly what he is doing," the judge said. "And now, so do you." Jessica's mask cracked right there, hairline first, then in shards. "You told me this would be simple," she hissed at David, forgetting where she stood. "You said he had nothing. You promised we could fix everything." Then louder, a tremble in her throat. "You said the paperwork was already handled." David swallowed. "It's a misunderstanding," he said to her, to the judge, to anyone who would listen. "It's not what it looks like." She laughed once, a short, sharp sound. "It looks like debt," she answered. "It looks like you lied." The bailiff took a measured step forward, not to intervene, but to mark the boundary. The judge's eyes closed for a brief second, the kind of mercy a man gives himself before he keeps doing his job. We left the courtroom for a hallway that smelled of dust and morning coffee. Mrs. Alvarez squeezed my forearm with the small strength of a friend whose belief never wavered. Earl clapped my shoulder once, a weighty, wordless blessing. Robert tucked the certified copy of the order into my folder with the trust documents. He spoke low, so it landed in my bones. "We're not gloating," he said. "We're securing." I nodded. "I know," I told him. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. Even my steps were steady, like a man walking on a floor he had laid himself on. Outside, the sun sat high, and the flag over the courthouse moved just enough to remind the eye how air works. David and Jessica stood across the steps, arguing in muted tones that carried more anger than sound. Jessica's face was wet. David's hands cut the air in small, helpless shapes. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at it like it might change everything if he stared long enough. Then he called. I knew that posture. The desperate push for another door when the one you wanted has closed. Robert's phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked down, silenced it, and met my eyes. "Not yet," he said. "Not today." We drove straight to the recorder's office. A narrow room, high counters. A woman with a badge that said, "Supervisor," scanned our documents with the calm precision of someone who understands that paper creates the world we live in. She stamped, scanned, and indexed. "There," she said. "Anyone searching the title will see this first." Her voice was the soft thud of a lock engaging. When she handed me the receipt, she paused. "Sir," she added, "you did the right thing." Simple words. Enough to fill the empty spaces that laughter had tried to claim. Back home, the house felt new without moving a stick of furniture. Light fell through the same windows, but it landed on different ground. I placed the court order at the top of the folder, then walked to the mantel and looked at Mary's photograph. "Do you see?" I asked the air, and the air answered by staying warm around my shoulders. I took down David's diploma. I did not smash it. I wrapped it in brown paper and set it in a closet. It no longer needed to hang where I could bump into the ache of it. It belonged to the past again, where it could not boss the present. At dusk, Robert met me at the dining table for the last signatures. He laid the updated will on the wood I had sanded and oiled with my own hands. He pointed to the lines that mattered. I read them. I did not rush. I did not stall. The pen moved the way a river moves around a bend. It knows by heart. When I finished, Robert exhaled the breath he had been holding. "Tom," he said, "this closes every hole." I looked at the clock, at the way the hands touched 7, like two people meeting at a train station, on time at last. "Good," I said. "Tomorrow they'll learn what consequences look like." Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, and for a moment my body readied itself for what it had always done. Apology, retreat, the old habit of making small to survive. The habit did not come. Did not. I stood, stretched my back, and walked to the porch. The neighborhood hummed with normal life. A sprinkler ticked on and off. A child skated past, wheels rattling on the uneven sidewalk. Across the street, Mr. Greer dragged his trash can to the curb and lifted a hand. I lifted mine. The ordinary had not left me. I had left it. And now I had walked back. Inside, I poured hot water over a tea bag and watched the color bloom. I thought about the courtroom, about David's face when the judge said, "He knows exactly what he is doing." I thought about Jessica's voice when she asked him why he lied. Their plan hadn't only fallen to pieces in front of a judge. It had cracked between them, the way thin ice breaks under weight it pretends it can carry. That is how truth works. It waits. Then it speaks. And when it speaks, it does not bargain. I carried the tea to the table and sat where I could see the front door, the mantel, and the chair I had chosen when my hands were younger. I placed the keys beside the cup so their metal could catch the light. They were not trophies. They were tools. I would use them to lock my doors at night and to open them in the morning. I would use them to remind myself that I had taken back what I had given away out of fear. I would use them to sleep. The phone lit up with a number I knew too well. I let it ring until it stopped. A text followed, long, crowded with explanations and commands, the same rhythm I had swallowed for months. I deleted it without reading. The quiet that came after was not empty. It was full of something I had not felt in a very long time. I searched for the word. Peace. Not the kind that forgets a fight. The kind that recognizes you can stand in your own doorway and decide who comes in. Before I went to bed, I opened the folder one last time. The deed, the trust, the order, the bank letters, the receipts from the recorder. The denial letter for a loan that David had hoped would save him. The judgments were with Jessica's name printed in black ink. Ugly things. Necessary things. I closed the folder and pressed my palm flat on the cover. "They thought I was weak," I said into the room, "but now they see the consequences." I turned out the lights, one switch at a time, feeling the house settle around me like a good coat. As I pulled the bedroom shade, the moon sat over the maple like a coin held between two fingers. I smiled. Tomorrow would not be noisy. It would be simple. They would come with questions or anger or apologies shaped like traps. I would not argue. I would point to the papers if I had to, or I would say nothing and let the new locks speak for me. Either way, the truth would hold. If you have ever been told you are nothing in the home you built, if you have ever been laughed at for the love you gave, I know how that hurts. It is a cold that gets into your bones. It is a weight that steals your breath. But there is warmth on the other side of a door that closes with your hand on the key. There is breath on the far side of a sentence that says, no. There is a life where respect lives in the same room as you do. I lay down, pulled the blanket to my chest, and let the clock count the seconds like soft rain. Tomorrow would come. I was ready to meet it. Feeling dismissed like this is hard, isn't it? If you believe every person deserves to be seen and respected, comment the word justice. Now watch what they do when that word becomes real. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. When they came back, the evening light had just started to slip behind the houses. I sat in the living room, the new locks already clicked shut, the envelope of keys resting heavy in my pocket. I heard the sound first, the rattle of David's key in the door, then the pause, then the rattle again, harder, sharper. His voice cracked through the wood. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. Jessica tried next, her heels scraping against the porch as if pressure alone would make the lock obey. I leaned back in the chair, hands folded, and let the quiet answer them. Their belongings were still inside, their shoes by the door, her coat on the rail, the life they assumed they owned, spread across my floors. But they were on the outside, pounding, as if they were strangers. The yelling grew louder, louder than the cicadas in the trees. "Dad, open this door right now," David roared, his voice carrying down the street. Jessica's shrill tone followed. "This is insane. You can't do this." Curtains lifted in the houses across the way. Neighbors came out on porches. Mrs. Alvarez, still holding her little dog, shook her head and muttered something I couldn't hear. A couple walking back from the store slowed down, bags in their hands, watching as my son beat his fists against my door like a burglar. Their embarrassment was visible in the way their voices cracked. Jessica hissed at him, "Everyone's staring! Stop yelling!" But he couldn't stop. Rage and shame mix badly. They make a man louder when he should be quiet. I stood in the hallway and watched shadows move across the frosted glass. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one humiliated. Their fury turned inward. Jessica's voice sliced through his. "You promised me. You told me this was settled, that the house was practically ours. How could you be so stupid as not to check the papers?" David tried to grab her wrist, tried to hush her, but she yanked away. "Don't touch me," she barked. "You're the reason we're in this mess." She spat the words like venom, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The shame was no longer mine. It was theirs, spread across the driveway for the whole block to witness. I thought of the night they mocked my stew, called it poor food. Now they were the ones swallowing humiliation. The sound of their marriage cracking was louder than their fists. The next morning, Robert called to tell me David had already been fishing for another lawyer. But the filings we'd done were clean, tight, unshakable. Every line of the trust deed, every notice, every freeze on the accounts, they were iron doors he couldn't pry open. Robert chuckled low, not in gloating, but in certainty. "He'll shop around," he said, "but no lawyer worth his license will touch this. You're protected." Hearing that, I felt like a man finally standing on solid earth after years of shifting ground. I started doing something I hadn't done in a long time. Living. That afternoon, I walked down to the corner cafe, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat outside under the awning. The steam rose against the chill, and I let myself taste it slowly, without rushing back to tend to someone else's demands. Across the street, kids rode their bikes, the spokes humming. For the first time in years, the house behind me felt like mine. Not a cage, not a battlefield, but a home. I planted a few tomatoes in the small patch of soil by the porch. I greeted neighbors without shame in my voice. I slept with the windows open and heard nothing but the sound of leaves in the night. Days later, David tried again. Not with fists, not with rage, with words. He came in the late afternoon, stood by the gate, and called up to me while I watered the garden. His voice was thin, strained. "Dad, please. Can we talk? I didn't mean for it to go this far. We're family. I don't want to lose you." I let the water run into the soil, dark and rich, before I answered. "You lost me long before you lost this house," I said. He flinched like I'd struck him. "There isn't a slap strong enough to erase the truth. Respect doesn't come after fists. It comes before, and you showed me none. You—" He lowered his head, mumbled something about Jessica, about mistakes, but I turned and went inside. The gate creaked when he left. I didn't watch him go. They sent messages after that, long, rambling apologies, then angry accusations, then more apologies. I didn't answer. Forgiveness doesn't come from reading words on a screen. Forgiveness comes when you choose to stop carrying someone else's poison in your heart. I had put it down. I wasn't picking it back up. Weeks passed, and peace settled in like an old friend. I joined a small gardening club at the community center. Met men and women my age who laughed without cruelty, who traded seeds and stories. I picked up a paintbrush again, something I hadn't done since Mary was alive. I painted the maple tree in the backyard, the same one where David used to swing as a boy. The strokes were clumsy, but they were mine. On Sundays, I walked with Earl to the park, sat on the benches, and fed the birds. I wasn't lonely, I was alive. Meanwhile, their world shrank. I heard whispers from neighbors that David and Jessica had moved into a cramped rental across town. The shine was gone from their faces when I glimpsed them once at the grocery store. Their cart was half empty, their voices low. They walked past me without speaking, and I let them. They carried their own shadows now. That was enough. One night I sat by the window, the deed and trust papers tucked safely in the cabinet, and thought about what was next. The house was mine, but the walls carried too many echoes. I began to wonder if selling it might be the final act of freedom. 600,000, maybe more, enough to start fresh in a smaller place, closer to the park, closer to friends. I smiled at the thought, not because I was running away, but because I had earned the right to choose. The lesson lay plain before me. Blood makes relatives, but respect makes family. Money reveals character, and sometimes what it reveals is ugly. But dignity is not for sale, not for rent, not even for inheritance. I whispered it to myself as I turned off the light. I don't need them anymore. I have myself. The next morning, I tucked a small brochure from a retirement community into the folder, not as a commitment, but as a possibility. I felt light, unburdened. Tomorrow would come, and with it, maybe a new project, a new chapter. For now, I had my keys, my peace, and my own name on the deed. That was enough. The papers were signed on a quiet Wednesday morning. I sat in the office across from the realtor, the smell of fresh coffee in the air, and slid my pen across the line that finalized the sale. 6 figures glowed back at me in black ink, $520,000. That house, once the battlefield of my humiliation, has now become a door I closed forever. Hours later, I held a new set of keys in my hand. A modest condo, $200,000, tucked near the park where the oak trees shaded the benches. From the balcony, I could see the fountain in the distance, and when the evening breeze carried children's laughter up through the windows, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. It was strange at first to wake without the weight of someone else's contempt pressing down on me. I made coffee in a smaller pot, ate breakfast with the morning sun warming my table, and realized that silence wasn't loneliness. It was peace. I began walking each morning through the park, greeting the same faces, people who smiled back instead of sneering. There was a community center nearby, its doors always open, and one afternoon I stepped inside. They welcomed me like I had always belonged. Before I knew it, I was part of the seniors club, helping organize small events, even joining a group that tended the community garden. Dirt under my fingernails never felt so good. The garden rows reminded me of my younger years when I worked long hours only to provide for a family that later turned their backs on me. Now, every tomato plant I watered was mine. No one could mock me, no one could rip it away. We traded cucumbers for flowers, stories for laughter. I found friends again, men and women my age who spoke of grandchildren with pride, who looked at me without judgment. I had been a ghost in my own house. Now I was a man among equals. But as my life found color again, theirs dimmed into shadow. Word reached me from an old neighbor. David and Jessica had moved into a cramped rental on the far edge of town. Peeling paint, a broken mailbox, and stairs that groaned with every step. The dream they had tried to steal from me slipped like sand through their fingers. Jessica was seen shouting at him outside their apartment, her arms crossed tight, his head hung low. Their marriage, built on greed, was rotting in public view. Neighbors whispered that they no longer held their heads high. They hurried into stores, avoided familiar faces, and were no longer the golden couple they had imagined themselves to be. One evening, I returned from the community center to find an envelope slid under my door. My name is in shaky handwriting on the front. I opened it carefully, though I already knew. It was David's words spilling across the page, apologies strung together, excuses hidden between the lines. I was wrong, Dad. I see it now. We let money blind us. Please, can we talk? My eyes lingered on the sentences, then drifted to the window where the park lights glowed. I folded the letter, placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and closed it. I don't need their apology, I whispered to myself. I have my life. I learned something in that moment. Forgiveness is not about hearing someone say they're sorry. Forgiveness is about refusing to let bitterness live rent-free in your soul. I had already forgiven myself for tolerating their cruelty too long. That was enough. As weeks rolled into months, I poured some of the money into causes that mattered. I donated to the senior center, ensuring that those who came after me would have the same welcoming place I found. I volunteered at a shelter, serving meals to people whose stories echoed my own, betrayals, losses, but also resilience. One old man with trembling hands took my arm after I placed a tray before him and said, "You make me feel seen." That word stuck with me, seen. For years in my own home, I had been invisible, dismissed, and disrespected. Now strangers could see me more clearly than my own blood ever did. One afternoon in the park, while I sketched the fountain with a pencil on cheap paper, a little girl no older than 6 walked up to me. She held a dandelion in her tiny fist, its seeds trembling in the breeze. "For you," she said simply, placing it on my lap before skipping back to her mother. I stared at that little flower, delicate and fleeting, and felt tears sting my eyes. Sometimes kindness comes from the places you least expect. It reminded me why stepping out of the toxic circle had been the right choice. I often thought about lessons, not for myself anymore, but for those who might hear my story. For parents, I would say, don't give everything away until you've remembered your worth. Sacrifice should never mean erasing yourself. For children, I would say, respect is the inheritance that lasts longer than money. Wealth fades, but the way you treat your parents marks your soul forever. And for everyone in this modern world, I would say, greed can twist even the closest ties, but truth and character outlast betrayal. I had chosen to build my life on that truth, and life in turn gave me moments of peace money could never buy. Sitting in my small condo, its 2 rooms filled with light, I cherished the simplicity. The condo might be worth $200,000, but to me it was priceless. On the table lay my father's old pocket watch, its face scratched from years of use. That watch reminded me daily, time is the only wealth we can never reclaim, so spend it with dignity. Meanwhile, David and Jessica's silence grew louder than their shouts ever had. They sent no more letters. Perhaps shame kept them quiet, or perhaps pride. Either way, I did not go searching. The chapter with them had closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. Their faces no longer haunted my nights. When I lay my head on the pillow, I slept. Truly slept. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the park in orange and gold, I sat on the bench with Earl, my walking companion. We watched the children play, the dogs chase balls, and the old couples hold hands. Earl nudged me and asked, "You ever regret cutting them off?" I thought for a long moment, then shook my head. "No," I said softly, "because in the end, character is the only inheritance worth keeping, and I kept mine. That's the truth I carry now, not the weight of betrayal, not the sting of their laughter, not the echo of their slap. I carry the lesson that dignity is wealth, no thief can steal." And as I close this chapter of my life, I find myself whispering the same words each morning when I wake. I finally found where I belong. Every day proves I made the right choice. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.